The Crimson Dawn, the galaxy had enjoyed 4,000 years of unbroken peace. 52 species had joined together to form the Galactic Union, a confederation built on trade, knowledge sharing, and mutual prosperity. From the crystalline cities of the Morph to the floating gardens of the Zephyrs, civilization had flourished in ways that the ancient peoples could never have imagined. War was a concept found only in history texts, a relic of a more primitive time. Children grew up believing that the stars belonged to everyone, that the universe was fundamentally safe, and that tomorrow would always be better than today. They were wrong. The Cav came without warning. No distress signals preceded them. No astronomical phenomena announced their arrival. They simply appeared at the edge of the Morph system, emerging from the deep black spaces between stars where even light feared to travel. At first the Morphians thought they were looking at a fleet of ships, thousands of vessels, arranged in strange geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to observe. But as the objects drew closer, the terrible truth became clear. These were not ships in any traditional sense. They were alive. The Calvith defied every law of biology and physics that the Union had spent millennia documenting. They were biomechanical nightmares, creatures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Their bodies were masses of twisted metal and pulsing flesh, held together by forces that Union scientists could not measure or understand. They moved through the vacuum of space as easily as fish through water, propelled by organs that generated reality distortions. When they fed, they did not simply consume matter, they erased it from existence, breaking down everything from starships to planets into base energy that they absorbed directly into their collective consciousness. Morphian home world of Crystal Prime had been a jewel of the galaxy. 7 billion beings had lived there. Their entire civilization built from living crystal that sang with harmonic frequencies. They had developed technologies that could shape matter at the molecular level, create art that existed in 11 dimensions, and compose music that could be heard across light years. In 6 hours, the Cav reduced it all to silence. The living crystals shattered. The songs died. 7 billion voices were extinguished, and the Cav moved on, their hunger unsatisfied. General Tak had watched his own world die 3 weeks later. He was a keel tone, a species that resembled bipedal lions with golden fur and eyes that could see into the infrared spectrum. His people had been warriors once, thousands of years ago. Before they had learned the value of peace, they had kept their military traditions alive, not out of necessity but out of respect for their ancestors. Tak had spent 2 centuries training for battles he never expected to fight, leading war games against theoretical enemies, teaching tactics for conflicts that would never come. When the Cav arrived, he learned that all his preparation had been meaningless. The Kaltoran Defense Fleet had been a source of pride. 150 vessels maintained at the peak of readiness. They had responded to the Cav incursion with precision and courage. Tak had commanded them from the bridge of his flagship, the Honor's Edge, and he had believed that military discipline and superior technology would carry the day. He had been a fool. The Calvith did not fight like anything in the tactical databases. They did not maneuver or retreat. They simply swarmed forward, absorbing damage that should have destroyed them. adapting to weapons with terrifying speed, every torpedo strike, every energy beam, every kinetic round, taught them something new. By the time the defense fleet had destroyed its first Caliph entity, the rest had learned to regenerate from those same weapons. Tak had given the evacuation order when 30 of his ships had been consumed. He had watched the Honor's Edge sister ship, the Vigilant Dawn, disappear into a writhing mass of cav tendrils, 3,000 crew members gone in seconds, their final transmissions cut off midscream. The civilian transports had managed to escape with perhaps 20% of Kelto's population, 4 billion souls left behind to face the swarm. Tak could still hear their voices in his dreams, calling out for rescue that would never come. The pattern repeated across Union space with mechanical inevitability. The Zephron, a species of graceful beings who lived in floating cities suspended in their planet's thick atmosphere, were next. Their world had been a paradise of art and philosophy. The cav fell upon them like rain, pulling their cities from the sky and devouring everything within. The Corinth master engineers, who had built the Union's first faster than light drives, watched their four worlds go dark one by one. The Silani, telepathic beings who had served as the Union's mediators and counselors, found that their mental gifts meant nothing to creatures that thought in dimensions beyond comprehension. Dr. Sarah Cade had been on Refuge Prime when the first survivors started arriving. She was human, or at least she carried human DNA, mixed with genetic enhancements that her ancestors had developed generations ago. At 35 years old, she had been one of the Union's leading xenobiologists, spending her career studying the incredible diversity of life across the galaxy. Her specialty had been symbiotic relationships between species, the delicate balances that allowed different forms of life to coexist and support each other. The cav were a mockery of everything she had learned. They were not symbiotic, they were parasitic beyond measure, and they grew stronger with everything they consumed. Sarah had volunteered to study the Calvith remains that surviving warships had managed to retrieve, working in a sealed laboratory deep beneath Refuge Prime surface. She had dissected fragments of cav tissue and analyzed their bizarre structures. What she found had given her nightmares. The cav were not a natural evolution. They had been created, engineered by some intelligence that had long since been consumed by its own creation. Every cell contained genetic code from thousands of different species, all of it twisted and recombined into something that should not exist. They were a weapon, she realized, a doomsday device that had outlived its makers and now roamed the galaxy like a cancer. Refuge Prime had become the last sanctuary. It was a world on the very edge of Union space, deliberately chosen because it was far from major trade routes and difficult to locate. 40 billion refugees had crowded onto a planet designed to support perhaps 5 billion. They lived in emergency shelters that stretched across entire continents, rationing food and water, trying to maintain hope in the face of extinction. The Union Council met in a bunker complex that had once been a mining facility, its chambers filled with representatives from species that might not survive another month. Ambassador Lyra Chen stood before the council and spoke of humanity. She was Sarah's mother, a woman in her 60s who had dedicated her life to diplomacy and peacekeeping before the Calbeth crisis. She had been preparing for retirement, planning to return to Earth and spend her final years in the gardens of New Shanghai. Now she stood before the most powerful beings in the galaxy and asked them to beg for help from a species they had betrayed. The Syndicate War had happened 150 years ago. Humanity had been young then, having joined the Union only a few decades earlier. They had been eager and idealistic, believing in the Union's principles of mutual defense and collective security when the Syndicate, a rogue faction of militant Corinth, had invaded human colonies. Humanity had called for Union assistance. The call had been denied. The Council had debated for weeks while human civilians died. Some species had argued that Earth's colonies were too far from the core worlds to defend. Others had suggested that humanity needed to learn to handle its own problems. In the end, the Union had voted to remain neutral, declaring that conflict an internal matter that did not threaten the greater peace. Humanity had fought alone. They had lost 6 colonies and 2 billion people before they managed to push the Syndicate back. The war had cost them dearly, but it had also changed them. When the fighting ended, humanity had withdrawn from the Union without formal declaration. They had simply gone home, erected an energy barrier around their space that the Union called the Shroud, and disappeared. For 150 years, no communication had passed through that barrier. No ship had entered or left. Humanity had become a ghost story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolationism and wounded pride. General Tak had opposed contacting Earth. He had argued that humanity would either ignore the message or, worse, use the Union's weakness to exact revenge for past betrayals. Other Council members had agreed, suggesting that humanity might have even allied with the Calvets somehow, that they might be waiting for the Union to destroy itself before emerging to claim the remains. Ambassador Chen had listened to these arguments with patience born of long practice, and then she had spoken. She had reminded the Council of humanity's history. Humans had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times before reaching the stars. They had survived ice ages and plagues, world wars and environmental collapse. They had looked extinction in the face repeatedly and had always chosen to fight rather than surrender. When the Syndicate had attacked, humanity had not possessed the strongest weapons or the vastest ships. They had won through sheer determination and tactical creativity, inventing new strategies on the battlefield and adapting to situations that should have been hopeless. If any species understood how to fight against impossible odds, it was humanity. The vote had been close. In the end, desperation had won over pride. A single message had been composed, stripped of diplomatic niceties and empty flattery. It had explained the situation simply. The Cav were consuming the galaxy. 52 species faced extinction. The Union military had been reduced to 147 operational warships from an original fleet of 8,000 in 6 months. Perhaps less. The swarm would reach Refuge Prime, and that would be the end of everything. The message had not apologized for the Syndicate War. It had not made excuses. It had simply asked for help and acknowledged that humanity owed the Union nothing. Ambassador Chen had added a final paragraph herself. She had written about her daughter Sarah, about the children playing in the refugee camps about the elderly, Morphians who sang songs of their dead. World to comfort themselves, she had written that she understood if humanity chose to remain behind the shroud, that perhaps isolation was the wisest choice in a universe full of predators, but she had also written that if humanity still believed in the values they had once proclaimed, if they still thought that life was worth defending even when it belonged to those who had failed you, then now was the time to prove it. The message had been transmitted toward Earth using every communication method the Union possessed: quantum, entanglement beacons, hyperspace, broadcasts, even old-fashioned radio waves. Then they had waited. Days became weeks, weeks became months. The Cav continued their advance, and from humanity there was only silence. Scout ships reported that the shroud remained impenetrable, showing no sign that the message had even been received. General Tak prepared his forces for the final battle, knowing that 147 ships would not be enough. Dr. Sarah Kate continued her research, searching for weaknesses that did not exist. Ambassador Chin checked the communication arrays every morning, hoping for a reply that never came. 2 months after the message had been sent, Union deep space sensors detected the Cav mother core entering the refuge system. It was not like the other Cav entities. It was vast beyond comprehension, a thing the size of a small moon that served as the central intelligence for the entire swarm. Where it went, billions of Cav followed, emerging from dimensional rifts that it tore in space itself. It had personally overseen the consumption of 20 home worlds, and now it had come for refuge. Prime General Tak gave the order to prepare for battle. Every able-bodied being was issued whatever weapons could be found. Civilians were moved to the deepest shelters, though everyone knew it would make no difference in the end. Far away beyond the shroud, in a system that no Union ship had entered in a century and a half, Captain Marcus Webb sat in his ready room and read Ambassador Chen's message for the hunt. Time, he was a man of 48 years with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that came from spending most of your life in space. His eyes were gray, the color of Earth's winter oceans, and they held a sadness that never quite went away. His great-grandmother had died in the Syndicate War, killed when the colony of New Horizon had been bombarded from orbit. He had grown up hearing stories about how the Union had abandoned humanity, how they had debated and politicked while real people suffered and died. The UHSN Nightfall was his ship, his responsibility, and perhaps humanity's answer to 150 years of isolation. She was 5 km of stealth technology and quantum engineering, the product of a civilization that had spent a century and a half doing nothing but growing and learning, while the Union believed humanity had retreated to lick its wounds. The truth was far more interesting. Humanity had been building not just ships or weapons, but an entirely new understanding of the universe itself. The shroud was not a wall, it was a laboratory, a chrysalis, where humanity had transformed itself from a wounded species into something the galaxy had never seen. Captain Webb stood and walked to his window, looking out at Earth hanging in the darkness. Below, somewhere down there, his daughter was starting her first day at university. His ex-wife was probably at work in the Mars terraforming project. Life went on behind the shroud, peaceful and prosperous in ways that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of the Syndicate War. They had earned that peace through blood and sacrifice. Part of him wanted to keep it that way, to let the galaxy burn and keep humanity safe behind their barrier, but another part of him remembered his great Chi. Grand and Mothra's last transmission. She had been 83 years old when she died, a teacher at New Horizons Primary School. In her final message recorded as the Syndicate bombardment began, she had not cursed the Union for their betrayal. She had simply said that she hoped humanity would never become the kind of species that could watch others suffer and do nothing. She had said that being better than your enemies was easy, but being better than your own worst impulses was what defined civilization. Commander Sarah Park entered without knocking. She was his executive officer and had served with him for 12 years. At 42, she was a tactical genius who had never lost a war game simulation. She was also one of the few people who could read his moods well enough to know when he needed to talk. She sat across from him and waited, giving him the silence to gather his thoughts. Webb finally spoke. Earth's unified command had made their decision. 3 days ago, one ship would answer the Union's call. Not a fleet, not an armada, just one vessel to see if this was genuine or some elaborate trap. If it was real, one ship would be enough. If it was a deception, humanity would lose only one crew and remain hidden. The Nightfall had been chosen because she was the most advanced warship humanity had ever built, and because Captain Webb was known for his caution and tactical judgment. He would not commit to a battle he could not win, and he would not trust the Union blindly. Commander Park nodded slowly. The crew had been briefed. They understood the mission and the risks. Many of them had their own reasons for wanting to stay behind the shroud, their own family histories of loss and betrayal. But they also understood that 40 billion refugees were waiting to die, and that humanity had the power to stop it. The vote among the crew had been close, but in the end, duty had won over history. The Nightfall's engines began their startup sequence. Deep within the ship, quantum cores that operated on principles the Union had not yet discovered began spinning up to operational power. The crew of 700 moved to their stations with practiced efficiency. Chief Engineer David Torres managed the power distribution systems, making sure every system received exactly what it needed. Navigation Officer Lieutenant James Kim calculated the course through the shroud and beyond. Tactical Officer Lieutenant Commander Rachel Yano armed weapons that had never been fired in anger. Operations Manager Ensign Marcus Stone coordinated the thousands of tasks that kept a vessel this size functioning. Captain Webb stood on the bridge and looked at his crew. They were afraid. He could see it in the tension of their shoulders, the way their hands moved a little too quickly over their consoles. They had trained for this moment, but training and reality were different things. None of them had ever fired a shot at a living enemy. Humanity had been at peace for 150 years. He activated the shipwide communication system. His voice carried to every deck and compartment. He told them that they were about to do something that many people would question. They were going to help those who had once abandoned them. He did not ask them to forget the past or pretend that the Union's betrayal had not mattered. He simply asked them to remember what his great Chi Grand and Mothra had said. Being better than your enemies was easy. Being better Then your own worst impulses was what? Define civilization, the nightfall. Move toward the shroud, for a moment. The energy barrier shimmered like aurora light, then the ship passed through, and for the first time in 150 years, a human vessel entered the wider galaxy. Space opened before them, vast and dark and full of dying civilizations. Commander Park called out. The course coordinates, Chief Torres reported that the quantum drive was operating at maximum efficiency. Athena, the ship's artificial intelligence, began scanning every frequency for tactical data. Webb gave the order that would change everything. Set course for Refuge Prime, maximum speed. We have galaxy to save. The nightfall accelerated into the darkness, a single shadow against the dying light of stars. Behind them, the shroud closed once more, keeping Earth's secrets safe. Ahead lay the Calvet swarm, billions of nightmares hungry for destruction. Between them and extinction stood 700 humans who had chosen to fight for people who did not deserve their help. The galaxy did not know it yet, but the balance of power had just shifted. Humanity had returned, and they were not the same species that had been abandoned 150 years ago. Shadows in the void. 2 months had passed since the message was sent to Earth, and the silence from humanity had become a weight that pressed down on every surviving soul. The galaxy, General Tok stood on the observation deck of his command station, watching the organized chaos of the final preparations below. Refugee ships were being loaded with supplies they would never use. Weapons were being distributed to civilians who had never fired a shot in anger, and prayers were being offered to gods who seemed to have abandoned their worshippers. The Cav Mother Core had been detected 3 days ago at the edge of the system, and with it came a swarm so vast that it blotted out entire sections of space. The thing was massive beyond any scale that made sense to the mind. Union sensors reported it as being roughly 8,000 km in diameter, a writhing sphere of biomechanical horror that pulsed with energies that defied measurement. It did not move through space so much as it dragged space along with it, creating gravitational distortions that could be felt light years away. Around it, like planets orbiting a dark star, millions of smaller Cav entities maintained perfect formation. They were coming slowly, deliberately, savoring the fear that radiated from Refuge Prime like a beacon. Dr. Sarah Cade had stopped sleeping 3 days ago. She worked in her laboratory without rest, driven by the desperate hope that she might find something, anything that could help. Her most recent discovery had only deepened her despair. The Cav were not simply consuming matter and energy, they were consuming information itself. Every civilization they destroyed, every species they erased, all of that knowledge and history was being absorbed into the Mother Core. It was building something, she realized, some kind of perfect understanding of the universe, gathered one dead world at a time. In a twisted way, the Cav were archivists, preserving everything they destroyed within their collective consciousness. It was the most horrifying form of immortality imaginable. Ambassador Chen had finally stopped checking the communication arrays. She had accepted that humanity was not coming, that perhaps they had never even received the message, or worse, that they had received it and chosen to ignore it. She could not blame them. The Union had earned its fate through its own cowardice and political calculation. She spent her final days helping organize the refugee camps, making sure the children had enough food, that the elderly were comfortable, that people could die with some measure of dignity. When the end came, it was all she could do. General Tak assembled his fleet. High orbit above Refuge Prime, 147 vessels pulled from a dozen different species, each one carrying crew members who knew they were about to die. They ranged from proper warships like his own flagship, the Resilience, to converted mining vessels that had been hastily armed with whatever weapons could be salvaged. There were no illusions about their chances. The best tactical projections gave them perhaps 40 minutes of combat effectiveness before the swarm overwhelmed them completely. 40 minutes to save 40 billion lives. It was not enough, but it would have to be far beyond the shroud. Captain Marcus Webb stood on the bridge of the UHSN Nightfall and watched the quantum drive readings climb to levels that should have been impossible. His ship had been traveling for 8 weeks at velocities that broke every speed record the Union had ever set. The quantum drive did not simply push the ship through space. It created localized distortions in spacetime itself, allowing the Nightfall to slip between dimensions and cover distances that would take conventional drives years to traverse. Even so, they were cutting it close. Long-range sensors showed the Calvet swarm had already reached the refuge system. Commander Sarah Park stood at his side, reviewing tactical data that Athena was compiling from Union distress signals. The artificial intelligence had been monitoring every broadcast, every coded message, every desperate plea that radiated from the dying sectors of Union space. What she had assembled was a comprehensive picture of the Calvata's capabilities, their patterns of attack, their apparent weaknesses. Park studied the data with the cold focus of a surgeon examining a patient. The news was not encouraging. The Calveth adapted to every form of attack within minutes. Energy weapons taught them to absorb and redirect energy. Kinetic projectiles taught them to harden their biomechanical structures. Nuclear weapons simply provided them with massive amounts of energy to consume. The Union had thrown everything they had at the swarm, and the swarm had learned from every attempt. Park looked at Webb and spoke the truth that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. If they fought the Calveth using conventional tactics, they would lose. The Nightfall was powerful, perhaps more powerful than anything the Union had ever built, but it was still just one ship. Chief Engineer David Torres reported from the engine room. He was a man in his 50s who had spent his entire adult life working with quantum systems. He understood the Nightfall's drives better than anyone alive, having helped design them during the long years behind the shroud. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who knew his machines would not fail him. The quantum cores were operating at 98% efficiency. Power distribution was stable across all systems. The Nightfall was ready for war. Lieutenant James Kim called out from the navigation station. They were approaching the boundary of the refuge system. In 15 minutes they would drop out of quantum drive and enter normal space. Once they did, every sensor the system would detect them. There would be no hiding, no second chances. Whatever happened next would determine the fate of the galaxy. Webb nodded and ordered the crew to battle stations. Throughout the ship, 700 men and women moved with practiced precision, securing hatches powering up weapon systems, running final diagnostic checks on equipment they had trained with for years but never used in combat. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Anquo sat at the tactical station and felt her heart racing despite her training. She was 36 years old, had graduated top of her class from Earth's Naval Academy, and had spent 12 years preparing for a moment that she had always hoped would never come. Her console showed the Nightfall's full arsenal, weapon systems that existed only in humanities, classified databases, phase shift, cannons that could fire projectiles that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, graviton pulse, generators that could create localized singularities, quantum torpedoes that could ignore conventional shields and armor, and the singularity cannon, a weapon so powerful that it could only be fired once before requiring hours to recharge. Ensign Marcus Stone managed the operation station, coordinating between every department on the ship. At 28, he was the youngest member of the senior staff, but his ability to process multiple data streams simultaneously had earned him his position. He monitored life support, power distribution, damage control teams, medical base status, and 100 other systems that kept the Nightfall functioning. Everything showed green. The ship was as ready as she would ever be. Athena's voice came through the bridge speakers. The artificial intelligence had been monitoring the battle that was already underway at Refuge Prime. Union forces had engaged the Calvet swarm approximately 6 minutes ago. Fighting was not going well. 8 Union vessels had already been destroyed, and the Calvet had barely committed a fraction of their forces. At the current rate of attrition, the Union fleet would be eliminated in 32 minutes. Athena calculated that the Nightfall needed to arrive within the next 14 minutes if they want to have any meaningful impact on the battle's outcome. Captain Webb made his decision. He ordered Kim to drop out of quantum drive at the system's edge and then proceed at maximum sublight speed. He wanted to assess the situation before committing to the fight. Park questioned the decision, pointing out that every second they delayed meant more Union casualties. Webb met her eyes and spoke with quiet authority. They had no intelligence on the Mother Corps' true capabilities. Rushing in blind would help no one. They would observe, analyze, and then strike where it would matter most. Nightfall dropped out of quantum space at the edge of the refuge system. For a moment, the bridge crew simply stared at the tactical display in stunned silence. The Calvet swarm was larger than anything they had imagined. Millions of entities filled the space between them and Refuge Prime, a living cloud of nightmares that stretched across billions of Killam. At the center of the formation, the Mother Corps pulsed with malevolent intelligence. It was watching the battle unfold like a conductor directing an orchestra, sending commands through quantum entangled connections to every entity in the swarm. General Tak watched another of his ships die. Cruiser Morning Star had been his second in command's vessel, carrying 300 crew members who had become his friends over decades of service. The Cav had swarmed over it like insects on a corpse, tearing through its hull and consuming everything inside. He had stopped feeling the losses individually. If he allowed himself to mourn each death, he would lose the ability to command. So he locked the grief away and continued giving orders, playing a tactical game. He could not win, buying minutes of life. For the billions of refugees below, then, something impossible appeared on his sensors. A single contact had emerged at the edge of the system. It was not a Union vessel. The energy signature was unlike anything in his databases. It was moving toward the battle at velocities that should have required quantum drives, but it was accomplishing this in normal space using technology he could not identify. For a moment hope flared in his chest, then he remembered that the Cav had been known to use deception. Perhaps this was a new tactic, a false ally sent to lower their guard before delivering the killing blow. Dr. Sarah Cade was in her laboratory when the alert came through. An unidentified vessel had entered the system. She pulled up the sensor data and felt her breath catch. The energy readings were extraordinary. Whatever was approaching used power generation methods that operated on principles she did not recognize. The ship's hull seemed to absorb sensor beams rather than reflecting them, making it difficult to get clear readings. But there was something about the signature, something that reminded her of old data. From before the shroud had gone up, she activated her communication panel and called her mother. Ambassador Chen was in the command bunker when her daughter's call came through. Sarah's words were breathless with excitement and disbelief. The unidentified vessel matched the energy profile of pre-shroud human technology, but amplified and refined beyond recognition. It was humanity had to be. They had come after all. Chin felt tears running down her face as she pulled up the tactical display. After 2 months of silence, after weeks of accepting that they would die abandoned and alone, humanity had answered their call. The nightfall accelerated toward the battle. Captain Webb watched the tactical display and formulated his strategy. The mother core was the key. As long as it lived, the swarm would continue to regenerate and adapt. Individual Calvith entities could be destroyed, but they would simply be replaced by new ones spawned from dimensional rifts the mother core created. They needed to kill the brain, and they needed to do it quickly before the swarm adapted to their weapons. He turned to Akin Quo and began issuing orders. Phase shift cannons would target the smaller entities, clearing a path. Graviton pulses would disrupt the swarm's formation, and when they got close enough, the singularity cannon would end the mother core. The Cav swarm detected the approaching vessel and began redirecting forces to intercept. Millions of entities broke formation and swarmed toward the nightfall, moving in coordinated attack patterns that demonstrated the mother core's intelligence. They had consumed dozens of civilizations and absorbed countless tactical databases. They knew how to fight, how to overwhelm, how to destroy. What they did not know was that they were about to face something entirely new. Lieutenant Commander Onquo initiated the first attack sequence. The phase shift cannons fired, sending projectiles that existed partially in normal space and partially in higher dimensions. The Cav entities that were struck did not explode. They simply ceased to exist. Their biomechanical structures unable to maintain coherence when portions of them were scattered across multiple dimensions. In the first 5 seconds, the nightfall destroyed more Calvet than the entire Union fleet had managed in an hour. The swarm recoiled in confusion. This was not supposed to happen. Their adaptive capabilities allowed them to counter any weapon within minutes of encountering it, but these weapons operated on principles that their collective intelligence could not immediately process. The phase shift. Cannons attacked on multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The graviton pulses created localized areas where the laws of physics changed. The quantum torpedoes ignored their biomechanical defenses entirely, detonating inside their structures before they could react. General Tak watched in awe as the unknown vessel carved through the calvet, swarmed like a blade through water. Every weapon it fired killed dozens of entities. Every movement it made left trails of destruction in its wake. The ship seemed to dance through the battle, appearing in one location and then another without crossing the space between. It was as if the vessel could predict where the cav would attack and simply not be there when the attack arrived. Commander Park coordinated the Nightfall's movements from her station. She had spent 12 years studying every tactical simulation humanity could devise, learning to think in 3 dimensions while her enemies thought in 2. Now she guided the ship through the swarm with the precision of a master conductor, calling out coordinates to Kim, marking priority targets for Aeon, Quo, managing power distribution with Tors. The bridge crew worked with seamless efficiency, 700 individual minds functioning as a single organism. The Caliph Mother Core watched this impossible development with something approaching curiosity. In its long existence, it had consumed millions of species and absorbed countless tactical databases. It had faced warriors and cowards, geniuses and fools. Nothing had ever survived its hunger for long. This new vessel was interesting. Its technology was advanced, certainly, but more than that, its crew fought with a creativity that the Mother Core had not encountered before. They did not follow standard tactical doctrine. They improvised, adapted, and invented new strategies on the battlefield. This species, whatever it was, would be a valuable addition to the collective. The Mother Core sent new commands through its quantum connections. The swarm began attacking in patterns designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Millions of entities converged on the Nightfall from every direction, simultaneously sacrificing themselves in waves to bring down this irritating vessel. The Nightfall shields flared under the onslaught. Warning lights flickered across bridge consoles. Chief, Tors shouted updates from the engine room, rerouting power through systems that were straining under loads they had never been designed to handle. Captain Webb made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the Nightfall to fire the Singularity cannon at 30% power, not at the Mother Core but at the swarm itself. It was a waste of their most powerful weapon, but they needed breathing room to reach their primary target. Akin Quo hesitated for only a second before executing the order. The Singularity cannon fired at the heart of the Calvet's swarm. Reality broke. A sphere of absolute nothingness appeared, a region of space where the fundamental forces of the universe simply stopped functioning. Everything within 10,000 km of the Singularity was pulled inward, compressed down to a point of infinite density, and then erased from existence. 2 million Calvith entities died instantly, their biomechanical structures crushed beyond any possibility of regeneration. The shock wave that followed scattered another 5 million, disrupting their formation and buying the Nightfall Precious seconds, General Tak could not believe what he was seeing. A single weapon had just eliminated more Calvat than the entire Union military had managed to destroy in 6 months of warfare. The unknown vessel was not just powerful, it was operating on a level of technology that the Union had not even theorized about. He opened a communication channel toward the mysterious ship, not knowing if they would respond or even understand Union standard language. His message was simple: whoever you are, we are grateful for your aid. How can we assist you? Response came in perfect Union standard, but the voice was unmistakably human. Captain Marcus Webb of the UHSN Nightfall identified himself and his vessel. He acknowledged the Union's greeting and gave them orders with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. All Union vessels were to pull back to defensive positions around Refuge Prime. They were to protect the refugee ships and civilian population. The Nightfall would handle the Mother Corps. Do not interfere with our attack run. Your weapons cannot harm this thing, but they can get in our way. The Cav Mother Corps felt something it had not experienced in its long existence: fear. This species, these humans, they were not like the others. The other species of the Union had fought with courage and desperation, but they had fought according to predictable patterns. Humans fought like nothing the Mother Corps had ever consumed. They broke rules, invented tactics that should not work, and wielded weapons that operated on principles the Mother Corps could not fully analyze. More than that, they fought with a cold determination that spoke of experience. This was not a species learning to fight. This was a species that had fought before and had learned from it. The Mother Corps decided to end this quickly. It stopped holding back its full power and began spawning new Cav entities directly from dimensional rifts. Billions more appeared, flooding the space between itself and the Nightfall. It also began charging its own primary weapon, a reality distortion beam that could tear holes in space-time itself. It had used this weapon to crack planets and destroy entire star systems. One ship, no matter how advanced, would not survive it. Captain Webb saw the energy build up in the Mother Corps and knew they were out of time. He turned to Park and gave her the final authorization codes. Commander Park input the codes into her console and felt the weight of what they were about to do. The Singularity Cannon was charging to full power, 100% output. At this level, the weapon would tear a hole in reality itself, creating a miniature black hole that would consume everything within 50,000 km before collapsing. The Nightfall would need to fire from extremely close range to ensure the Mother Corps was within the kill zone. That meant they would be caught in the weapon's effect radius. Athena calculated their survival probability at 12%. The artificial intelligence reported this information without emotion, but Webb could hear the concern in her voice. Athena had been with him since the Nightfall's first voyage. She had evolved beyond her original programming, developing something that resembled personality and perhaps even consciousness. She was not just his ship's computer, she was his friend. He told her that he knew the odds and that he accepted them. Some things were worth dying for. The Nightfall accelerated toward the Mother Corps. Every weapon system fired continuously, clearing a path through the swarm. Phase shift cannons, graviton pulses, quantum Torpedoes, even the ship's point defense. Lasers, everything was thrown against. The tide of nightmares that tried to stop them, the shields were failing. Hull breaches appeared on multiple decks, damage control teams fought fires and sealed corridors while the ship shook under constant impacts. Chief Torres worked miracles in the engine room, keeping the quantum core stable, despite damage that should have caused cascading failures. Lieutenant Kim plotted a serpentine course through the swarm, using every trick he had ever learned to keep the Nightfall moving. Ensign Stone coordinated evacuation of damaged sections and rerouted critical systems through backup channels. Lieutenant Commander Akon Kwo fired the weapons until her console overheated and then kept firing. The crew worked with the desperate efficiency of people who knew they were probably going to die but were determined to take their enemy with them. Dr. Sarah Cade watched from her laboratory on Refuge Prime. She had patched into the Union military sensor feeds and could see the human ship fighting its way toward the mother core. She whispered prayers to gods she did not believe in, begging the universe to let these brave humans survive. Her mother stood beside her, one hand gripping her daughter's shoulder, watching humanity fight for people who did not deserve their sacrifice. Nightfall reached optimal firing range. The singularity cannon was charged to full power, drawing so much energy that every other system on the ship had been reduced to minimum output. Captain Webb gave the order that would chain everything fire. The singularity cannon unleashed hell. A beam of twisted space-time lanced out from the Nightfall's bow, crossing the distance to the mother core in a fraction of a second. Where it struck, reality broke. The mother core tried to defend itself, tried to use its own reality distortion abilities to counter the attack, but the singularity cannon operated on a level beyond anything it had encountered. The black hole formed at the center of the massive creature, a sphere of absolute gravitation from which nothing could escape. The mother core screamed, not in any voice that could be heard through the vacuum of space, but in quantum frequencies that every sensitive being in the system felt in their bones. It was the sound of a god dying, of an intelligence that had consumed galaxies, being torn apart atom by atom. The black hole expanded, pulling the mother core's massive bulk inward, compressing 8,000 km of biomechanical horror down into a point smaller than an atom. The creature that had destroyed civilizations, that had erased 52 species home worlds, that had seemed unstoppable, simply ceased to exist. The effect on the swarm was immediate and catastrophic. Without the mother core's guiding intelligence, billions of Calvet entities lost their coordination. They began attacking each other, confused and directionless. Some flew into Refuge Prime Sun, others simply stopped moving, their biomechanical systems shutting down. Without the quantum signals that had animated them, within minutes the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known was reduced to floating debris. The Nightfall had survived, but barely. The black hole had collapsed as predicted, but not before pulling the ship partially into its event horizon. Hull plating had been torn away, entire sections were open to space. Casualties were severe. Captain Webb pulled himself up from the deck where the gravitation stress had thrown him and assessed the damage. They had lost 47 crew members, with another 98 injured. The quantum drive was offline and would need weeks of repairs, but they were alive, and, more importantly, 40 billion refugees on Refuge Prime would live to see another day. General Tak opened a communication channel to the Nightfall. His voice was thick with emotion as he thanked Captain Webb and his crew. He asked how the Union could ever repay such a debt. Webb's response was measured and deliberate. He told the general that humanity had not come seeking payment or gratitude. They had come because it was the right thing to do, but he also made it clear that the past had not been forgot. The Union had abandoned Earth once. If they wanted humanity's continued friendship, they would need to prove they had learned from their mistakes. Ambassador Chin stood in the command bunker and listened to the human captain's words. They were not cruel, but they were honest. Humanity was offering a second chance, but it would be on new terms, terms of mutual respect and actual commitment. She activated her communication panel and spoke to Captain Webb directly. She introduced herself and thanked him for saving her daughter's life along with billions of others. She promised that the Union would be different going forward, that they would honor the sacrifice his crew had made, and that they would never again abandon those who called for help. Webb listened to the ambassador's words and allowed himself a small smile. Athena was already compiling damage reports and coordinating with Union vessels that were offering assistance. Commander Park was organizing rescue operations for the crew members trapped in damaged section. Chief Torres was assessing how long it would take to restore basic functionality to the ship systems. The bridge crew was exhausted but satisfied. They had done something that mattered. They had saved lives and proven that humanity deserved its place among the stars. Dr. Sarah Cade stood on the observation deck of Refuge Prime and watched the human warship floating in orbit, its running lights flickering against the darkness. Around it, Union vessels were gathering, offering what aid they could. For the first time in months, she felt hope. The Calbeth were gone. The galaxy had survived, and humanity, the species that had been wronged and abandoned, had been the ones to save them all. Captain Webb looked out at the stars and thought about his great-grandmother. She had been right. Being better than your enemies was easy. Being better than your own worst impulses was what defined civilization. Humanity had proven today that they were still capable of being better, of choosing compassion over revenge, of fighting for life even when the lives belonged to those who had failed them. The galaxy would never forget what happened at Refuge Prime, the day a single human warship emerged from the void and ended the nightmare that had consumed 52 worlds. The day humanity returned to the stars, not as victims or isolationists, but as saviors. The day the universe learned that humans did not fight because they hated what was in front of them, but because they loved what was behind them, and that made all the difference.